The staff sergeant's voice cut through the kennel like a blade. "He's untrainable," she said, not bothering to lower her voice even though I was standing right there. The German shepherd, Tag said his name was Rex, sat behind chain link, watching me with eyes that had seen too much. I knew that look. I'd seen it in the mirror every morning for the past 15 years. The handler shook her head, making notes on her clipboard, the pen scratching against paper with a finality that made my jaw tighten. 3 handlers already. Aggressive, unresponsive, won't follow commands. We're probably putting him down next week. She said it like she was talking about broken equipment. Like this dog, this warrior who'd served in places most Americans couldn't find on a map, was nothing more than a failed experiment to be disposed of. I didn't say anything. Just stood there in my old ACU jacket, the one with the name tape faded from too many washings, the one I couldn't bring myself to throw away because it was proof I'd existed in that uniform, that I'd mattered for those 23 years. The kennel smelled like disinfectant and fear, concrete floors echoing with the barking of younger dogs in the front rows. The successful ones, the adaptable ones, the ones who'd learned to perform on command. Rex was isolated back here, separated from the others like contamination. Quarantined not because of disease but because of damage. And I looked at that dog, really looked at him, and saw the way he held himself. Alert, but resigned. Watchful, but defeated. Ready to fight, but tired of fighting. He tilted his head slightly and something passed between us. Understanding maybe. Recognition. The knowledge that comes when one broken thing sees another and realizes it's not alone. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The VA facility in Augusta, Georgia, sits off Washington Road, brick and glass trying to look welcoming but mostly just looking institutional. I come here twice a week now. Therapy sessions Dr. Morrison insists I need, though we both know talking doesn't fix what Afghanistan broke. I'm 62 years old, and my hands shake when helicopters fly overhead. The tremor started in Kandahar province in 2011, the day the IED took Rodriguez and Chen, left me with a Purple Heart and memories that play on loop at 3 in the morning. I still see Chen's wedding ring spinning in the dirt. Still smell the burning diesel and something worse. The facility's waiting room has those chairs. You know the type. Government issue. Upholstered in some industrial fabric designed to withstand everything except comfort. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, that particular frequency that sets your teeth on edge if you listen too long. Veterans sit scattered throughout, most of us maintaining that tactical spacing even in civilian spaces. Nobody's back to a door, everyone positioned to see exits. We don't talk about it. Don't need to. It's just how we exist now. The walls display paintings donated by local artists, landscapes mostly, pastoral scenes of Georgia countryside that bear no resemblance to the places where we broke. Rolling hills and red barns and oak trees dripping Spanish moss. Pretty lies. I prefer the honesty of concrete and chain link. The VA connects veterans with service dogs sometimes, matches that rarely work because both parties carry too much damage. They told me about the program 6 months ago, right after I'd had what they clinically called an episode in the parking lot, what I called a full-blown panic attack triggered by a car backfiring, left me on my knees between vehicles, hyperventilating, transported back to Kandahar. Dr. Morrison had sat with me in his office afterward, patient and professional, suggesting the service dog program might help with the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way I can't sit with my back to a door anymore, the way I check every room for threats before I can relax, which is never. I'd refused twice already. Didn't think I deserved the help, if I'm being honest. Didn't think anything could reach through the static that filled my head, the constant white noise of vigilance that hadn't stopped since I'd climbed off that transport at Fort Stewart in 2012, officially home but never really leaving the war behind. But today, walking past those kennels on my way to Dr. Morrison's office, I'd heard barking. Not the excited kind, but the desperate kind. The kind that speaks a language most people don't understand. The kind that says, I'm drowning and nobody sees me. I'm fighting and nobody cares. I'm still here but nobody's looking. So I'd stopped. Asked to see the dogs. The young handler couldn't have been more than 25, probably never deployed, had that clean look of someone whose trauma was still theoretical, had given me a look that said, why bother? But she'd walked me down the row anyway. Past the labs and the golden retrievers, the well-behaved prospects with bright eyes and wagging tails, the ones who'd adapt and serve and make their handlers proud. All the way to the back, where Rex sat alone in a double-sized kennel, separated from the others like he carried something contagious. The isolation felt familiar. When the staff sergeant came over and said those words, "He's untrainable," something in my chest tightened. That old familiar pressure that came before rage or grief or both. I knew what untrainable meant. It meant difficult, meant damaged, meant not worth the effort. Meant we tried the standard protocols, and they didn't work, so the problem must be you, not the protocols. I'd heard those words before, in different contexts, different voices, but always the same weight behind them. My whole life. The memory hit me standing there in that kennel, though it started 43 years ago in a different kind of cage. Fort Benning, Georgia, 1982. I was 19 years old, barely a week into basic training, and Drill Sergeant Kowalski had made his opinion of me clear from day one. "You people," he'd say, never quite finishing the sentence, but letting the weight of it hang there like smoke, like poison gas, like something you couldn't see but could feel coating your lungs. "You people don't have the discipline for this. Eh?" He'd stand so close I could smell the coffee on his breath, see the broken blood vessels in his nose, count the razor bumps on his neck where he'd shaved too close. "You people think you're owed something." The phrase "you people" did heavy lifting in his vocabulary, a catch-all that meant black, meant inferior, meant less than, meant not belonging here. I'd stood at attention, eyes forward, jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached, while he circled me like a predator assessing prey. My rack wasn't tight enough, even when the quarter bounced. My boots weren't shined enough, even when I could see my reflection. My salute wasn't sharp enough, even when it was textbook perfect. Nothing was ever enough. The other recruits, most of them white kids from small towns in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, boys who'd never talked to a black person before basic, who'd grown up with certain ideas about who belonged where, they made mistakes and got corrected. Standard stuff. Drop and give me 20. Run it again. Pay attention. But I made mistakes and got made an example of. Called to the front of the formation in front of 3 platoons. Dressed down with language that crossed lines. Humiliated publicly, systematically, deliberately. Extra PT until my muscles screamed and my hands bled from the pull-up bar. Firewatch shifts that meant I got 3 hours of sleep while others got 6. Every inspection detail, every latrine cleaning, every punishment detail somehow had my name on the roster. It wasn't official, wasn't written down anywhere, but it was there in every interaction, every assignment, every evaluation. I was other. I was less. I was the one who had to work twice as hard for half the recognition, run twice as fast to stay in place, be twice as perfect to be considered adequate. The worst part wasn't the physical abuse. I could handle that. The worst part was the isolation that came with it. Other recruits learned fast that associating with me meant drawing Kowalski's attention, so they'd avoid eye contact in the chow hall, leave empty seats beside me, talk around me like I was invisible. A few were sympathetic. I'd catch apologetic looks sometimes, but sympathy doesn't mean solidarity. Nobody risked their own standing to stand with me. By week 3, I'd heard whispers. "He's not going to make it." Heard Kowalski's recommending him for separation. "Some people just aren't cut out for the army." The whispers came from other drill sergeants, from training officers, from the platoon itself. I'd become a narrative, a cautionary tale, a walking example of predicted failure. I'd sat on my footlocker that night, dress uniform folded beside me according to regulation, seriously considering walking away. My father had served in Vietnam, came home to Mississippi in 1971, and couldn't find work for 2 years because nobody wanted to hire a black veteran, regardless of his service record or honorable discharge. He told me the military was different now, that things had changed, that I'd have opportunities he never did, that the uniform would protect me from the worst of what he'd faced. Sitting there at Fort Benning with Kowalski's words echoing in my head, "You people." I'd wondered if my father had lied or if he'd just been naive, if he'd told himself a story about progress because the alternative was too bitter to accept. But I didn't quit. Couldn't. Because quitting meant proving them right, meant confirming every assumption they'd made about me before I'd even arrived, meant giving them the satisfaction of the narrative they'd already written. So I'd stayed, worked harder, ran faster, shot straighter, made myself undeniable, even knowing that undeniable excellence often wasn't enough. The trigger was a sound, the particular rhythm of helicopter rotors cutting through humid southern air. A Black Hawk flew over the VA facility, probably heading to Fort Gordon, and suddenly I wasn't in Augusta anymore. I was back in the Hindu Kush, strapped into a vibrating metal coffin, watching the mountains scroll past through the open door. The smell of hydraulic fluid and fear sweat. The weight of my M4 across my chest. Rodriguez sitting across from me, making the sign of the cross the way he always did before missions. Chen next to him, showing me pictures of his daughter on his phone even though we'd seen them 100 times. "She turns 3 next month," he'd shouted over the rotor noise. "I'm missing her birthday." I'd nodded, checked my gear for the 10th time, tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. We'd been doing clearance operations in Kandahar province for 7 months by then, long enough to know that every mission could be your last, long enough to stop talking about it. The insurgents had gotten smart, learned our patterns, started hitting us with more sophisticated IEDs. Command kept saying we were winning. The guys doing the actual bleeding knew different. The helicopter banked left, started its descent toward the LZ, and I'd felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that said something's wrong, the one that said pay attention. I'd learned to trust that feeling after 18 years in the Army, 3 deployments, more close calls than I could count. We'd touched down in a cloud of dust, piled out, formed up. Standard procedure. Rodriguez on point, Chen covering right, me covering left. The village was supposed to be clear. Intelligence said so, but intelligence had been wrong before. The heat was crushing, 115 degrees, sweat running down my back under 70 pounds of gear. We'd moved through narrow streets, past mud brick compounds, past children who watched us with ancient eyes. Everything felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The base was Fob Walton, a collection of concrete barriers and canvas in the middle of nowhere, Afghanistan. We called it the Hourglass because of how the valley narrowed around it, made us vulnerable from 3 sides. I'd been assigned to Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment, attached to a clearance platoon that spent most of its time walking through places where people wanted us dead. My platoon sergeant was a guy named Brennan, 28 years old, red-faced, built like a fire hydrant. He'd come up through the ranks fast, made E6 in 6 years, had strong opinions about everything. I'd been in the Army since 1982, was an E7 by then, should have had my own platoon, but I'd been passed over for promotion 3 times. No official reason given, just not quite there yet, whatever that meant. So I'd ended up attached to Brennan's unit, technically senior but practically just another body. The dynamic was immediate and familiar. Brennan's inner circle, 3 white sergeants from Texas and Oklahoma. They got the plum assignments, the easier patrols, the credit when things went right. I got the grunt work, the dangerous jobs, the blame when things went sideways. Nothing you could point to, nothing you could report, just the slow accumulation of 1,000 small cuts. In the chow hall, they'd sit together, talk loud, throw glances my way when they made jokes I wasn't supposed to hear. During briefings, Brennan would ask everyone for input, then brush past my suggestions like I hadn't spoken. When we rotated guard duty, I'd somehow always pull the 200 to 1600 shift, the one that wrecked your sleep cycle. My assigned battle buddy was Turner, a private first class from Tennessee who'd barely made it through basic, who couldn't read a map if his life depended on it. Brennan's buddies got paired with competent soldiers. I got the liability. It happened on patrol, third week of deployment. We'd been checking a compound on the edge of the village, looking for weapons caches, the kind of mission we'd done 100 times. Standard 4-man team, Brennan, 2 of his guys, and me. The compound was empty, family supposedly gone to Kandahar, but you never really knew. We'd cleared the main house, moved to the outbuildings, found nothing. Then Brennan had called me over, pointed at a cellar door. "Check it out," he'd said. Not a request. An order. I'd looked at that door, felt every nerve in my body screaming wrong. No reason to put a lone soldier in a confined space without backup. Protocol said 2 minimum, covering each other. But Brennan was watching me with that expression I'd seen my whole career. The one that said, "Are you going to be difficult about this?" So I'd gone. Pulled the door open, descended wooden steps into darkness, my rifle light cutting through dust motes. The cellar was empty except for some pottery and old blankets. I'd started to turn around, head back up, when I'd heard it, the distinct click of a safety coming off. I'd frozen. Looked up. Seen Brennan at the top of the stairs, M4 raised, pointed down at me. For a second, maybe 2, we'd just looked at each other. His finger was on the trigger guard, not the trigger itself, but the message was clear. Down here, in this hole, accidents happened. Nobody would question it. Taliban sniper, friendly fire, fog of war. His face was blank, calculating. Then he'd lowered the rifle. Smiled. "Jumpy," he'd said. "Cellar's clear. Let's move." He'd walked away like nothing happened. I'd climbed those stairs on shaking legs, knowing I'd just looked at something most soldiers never see. The moment when it stops being about the mission and becomes about something else entirely. Something older and meaner. The escalation was gradual but steady, the way hypothermia sets in. We'd been running patrols out of Fob Walton for 6 weeks, and the pattern had solidified. Every dangerous assignment, every walking point through known IED zones, every compound clearance that smelled like an ambush, Brennan volunteered me. "Jackson's got experience," he'd say in briefings, making it sound like a compliment. "He can handle it." And I could. That was the thing. I'd survived deployments in Iraq during the surge, knew my job better than most, could read terrain and threats like some people read books. But there's a difference between being good at your job and being used as a human mind detector. The rest of the platoon noticed. Some looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. A few, like Rodriguez and Chen, started positioning themselves to back me up, volunteering for the same patrols, making sure I wasn't alone. We never talked about it directly, but I'd catch Rodriguez giving Brennan hard looks during briefings, hear Chen asking pointed questions about patrol assignments. That just made Brennan meaner. Started writing me up for minor infractions. Dirty weapon, even though I'd cleaned it the night before. Late to formation, even though I'd been there early. Uniform discrepancies nobody else got called on. Building a paper trail. Making sure if something happened to me, he could point to documentation that said I was substandard. One night I'd found dog tags on my rack. Not mine, they belonged to a soldier I'd never heard of. I'd asked around, learned the story. Sergeant Major Williams, killed in Vietnam, 1968. Black soldier, fragged by his own unit because he'd reported them for war crimes. The tags had been passed around as a joke for years, a warning. Stay in your lane. Don't make waves. When I'd looked around the tent, everyone had been conspicuously focused on their own business. Message received. The silence before action is a specific kind of heavy. We'd gotten intelligence about a high-value target in a compound 3 clicks north of the base. Taliban commanders supposedly coordinating IED emplacements throughout the province. Alpha Company was tasked with the raid, pre-dawn insertion, standard capture or kill mission. Brennan had gathered us for briefing at 2200 hours, maps spread across the plywood table in the operations tent. Everyone crowded around in full kit. The plan was straightforward. 4 teams, each taking a different approach, converging on the compound simultaneously. Team 1, Brennan's guys, would take the main entrance. Team 2 would secure the perimeter. Team 3 would provide overwatch from the high ground. And Team 4, me, Rodriguez, Chen, and Turner, would clear the outbuildings and secondary structures. The danger zone, the place where surprises happened. Rodriguez had met my eyes across the table, shook his head slightly. Chen looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out how to phrase it without sounding insubordinate. Turner was just pale, understanding he'd been assigned to the team nobody wanted. After the briefing, I'd stepped outside the tent, looked up at the Afghan stars, so bright out there in the middle of nowhere, the Milky Way like a river across the sky. Thought about my father, about all the times he'd told me to keep my head down, do my job, don't give them a reason. Wondered how many black soldiers over the years had stood under stars like these, knowing the next day might be their last, knowing their own brothers in arms were as much a threat as the enemy. Rodriguez had come out, stood beside me, didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "You don't have to take point tomorrow." "Somebody has to," I'd said. "Yeah, but it doesn't always have to be you." I'd appreciated that, appreciated him, but we both knew how it worked. The mission launched at 30 hours, darkness still complete, night vision turning the world green and grainy. 4 Humvees rolled out of Fob Walton in convoy formation, lights off, moving slow through the valley. I'd ridden in the third vehicle, M4 across my lap, watching the landscape scroll past through the ballistic window. The compound came into view just as the sky started to lighten. Mud brick walls, flat roof, a few scraggly trees, exactly like 100 other compounds we'd searched. Teams dismounted in coordinated silence, taking positions. Brennan's voice came through the radio. "Team 4, you're clear to move on the outbuildings. Watch for secondary exits." Rodriguez took point, Chen and I covering flanks, Turner bringing up the rear. We'd moved through the courtyard, past a rusted truck, past a well with a broken pulley. The first outbuilding was a goat shed, empty except for animal smell and scattered straw. The second was a storage building, pottery and tools, nothing unusual. The third building sat by itself, set back from the others, newer construction. Rodriguez had paused at the door, looked back at me. I'd nodded. He'd kicked it in. And that's when everything went to hell. The explosion wasn't huge, just a grenade rigged to the door frame. But in that confined space, it was enough. Rodriguez took most of the blast, thrown backward into the courtyard, his body armor shredded. Chen and I had hit the ground on instinct, ears ringing, dust everywhere. Then the gunfire started. Muzzle flashes from the main compound, from the roof, from windows we'd thought were clear. We'd been herded into a kill zone, and teams 1 and 2 were nowhere in position to support us. I dragged Rodriguez behind the goat shed, checked his vitals, found a pulse, but he was unconscious, bleeding from multiple fragment wounds. Chen was returning fire, controlled bursts, keeping their heads down. Turner was frozen, pressed against the wall, hyperventilating. The radio crackled. Brennan's voice, no urgency. "Team 4, sit rep. like he'd expected this. I'd fought in Iraq during the surge, cleared houses in Fallujah and Ramadi, earned my combat infantryman badge with actual combat, not just presence in a combat zone. I'd trained at the Ranger School at Fort Benning. Didn't get the tab because the evaluator found reasons to fail me that wouldn't stick to white soldiers, but I'd completed the training. I'd qualified expert with the M4, the M9, the M240B. I'd completed advanced combat lifesaver training, forward observer training, urban operations specialist training. 18 years of knowledge accumulated the hard way, through experience and survival. And in that moment, with Rodriguez bleeding out and Chen burning through magazines and Turner useless, and Brennan nowhere to be found, all that training took over. I'd pulled Rodriguez fully behind cover, applied pressure dressing to the worst of his wounds, stuck him with morphine, grabbed Turner by his kit, dragged him to a fighting position, put his rifle in his hands. "You shoot where I tell you, when I tell you. Understand?" He'd nodded, tears on his face, but he'd gotten his finger on the trigger. I'd grabbed the radio. "Team 4 to Team 1, we are pinned down, 1 urgent surgical, need immediate support, southwest corner of compound." Static. Then Brennan's voice. "Team 1 is engaged, cannot support at this time." Lie. I could hear their position from the sound of fire. They were in cover, taking pot shots, not actually pushing. I'd switched frequencies, bypassed Brennan. "Any unit, this is Sergeant Jackson, Team 4. We have urgent surgical and are danger close to being overrun. Need immediate fire support. Coordinates to follow." Chen had looked over at me, surprised I'd broken protocol. But protocol wasn't going to save Rodriguez. For the next 20 minutes, I'd directed our defense like I'd been trained to do, like I should have been allowed to do my whole career. Identified enemy positions, called out targets, managed ammunition, kept Turner from breaking completely. When I'd heard movement from the east side of the compound, I'd realized they were trying to flank us, called in the position to headquarters, adjusted our fire. The Taliban weren't stupid. They'd seen an isolated team and moved to exploit it. The mini-revelation came in the slack moment between firing, when adrenaline receded enough for memory to flood in. I was crouched behind that goat shed in Afghanistan, checking Rodriguez's pulse, and suddenly I wasn't there anymore. I was 8 years old in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, crouched behind my grandmother's porch while 3 white boys threw rocks and shouted words I'd learned early meant I was less than human. Words that reduced me to something animal, something disposable, something that didn't deserve to exist in their space. The rocks had sharp edges, not pebbles but actual stones pulled from the driveway, thrown with intent to injure. One had split my lip. Another had caught me above the eye, blood running down into my vision. I'd curled up small, making myself as tiny as possible, while they'd laughed and thrown and shouted. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. The worst part was understanding, at 8 years old, that nobody was coming to help. That my grandmother was inside cleaning house for a white family. That my mother was at work. That my father was overseas, and that the rules that applied to white children throwing rocks didn't apply to black children being hit by them. If I'd fought back, if I'd thrown even 1 stone in return, I'd have been the one in trouble. The police would have been called. My family would have faced consequences. So I'd stayed small, stayed quiet, waited for it to end. My grandmother had found me there after they'd gone, knees scraped, face dirty from tears I'd tried to hide, because showing pain felt like giving them something they didn't deserve. She'd cleaned me up without saying much at first, just gentle hands and warm water and antiseptic that stung. Then she'd sat me down at her kitchen table with sweet tea in a mason jar and cornbread still warm from the oven. And she'd looked at me with eyes that had seen generations of this same story. "Baby," she'd said, voice steady but weighted, "you're going to spend your whole life proving yourself to people who already decided you ain't worth nothing. You can let that break you, or you can let it forge you." Her hands rested on the table between us, scarred from years of domestic work, cleaning houses for white families who wouldn't let her use the front door, who paid her cash so they didn't have to acknowledge her as a legitimate employee, who called her by her first name while insisting she call them Mr. and Mrs. I'd asked her which one she chose. She'd shown me her hands, really showed them, turned them over so I could see every scar, every burn, every place where hard work had left its mark. "I chose to survive," she'd said. "But I want you to do more than survive. I want you to excel. I want you to be so good they can't ignore you, so capable they can't dismiss you, so excellent they have to acknowledge you even when it kills them to do it." So I had. Top of my class in high school despite guidance counselors who kept steering me toward vocational programs, who suggested trade school instead of college, who looked at my test scores and somehow still saw limitation instead of potential. Junior college when my family couldn't afford university, working 2 jobs while carrying a full course load, studying between shifts at the gas station and the warehouse. ROTC scholarship to finish my degree at Mississippi State, where I was one of 3 black cadets in the entire program, where professors seemed perpetually surprised when I excelled, as if intelligence and skin color existed in opposition. Army commission. Every step fighting against the undertow of low expectations, swimming upstream against a current that wanted to pull me under, exhaust me, make me give up, and accept the place society had designated for me. And it hadn't mattered. Because here I was, 18 years later, in a different country fighting a different war. And I was in the same fight. The war of proving I belonged, proving I was competent, proving I deserved to take up space, proving my existence had value. The uniforms had changed. The terrain had changed. The stated enemy had changed. But the fundamental question remained the same. Are you worth keeping alive? Rodriguez stirred, moaned, tried to move. I'd held him down, checked his dressings, seen the blood seeping through despite pressure and packing. "Stay still, brother. Help's coming." His eyes focused on me, glassy with pain and morphine, pupils dilated. "Jackson, the mission." "Forget the mission. We're getting out of here." His hand gripped my arm, surprising strength despite the blood loss. "They set us up," he'd whispered. And I'd known he didn't just mean the Taliban. He meant Brennan, meant the isolation, the deliberate positioning, the abandonment. He'd seen it too, understood what was happening even through the fog of trauma and medication. "I know," I'd said, "but we're going to survive anyway. Because that's what we do." The second attack came as the sun fully cleared the mountains, golden light turning the dust into something beautiful and deadly. The Taliban had regrouped, realized we weren't getting reinforcements, decided to make a real push. I'd counted at least 8 fighters, probably more in the compound we couldn't see, coordinating their movement with discipline that suggested training. They'd started with suppressing fire, keeping our heads down while 2 fighters moved to flank from the north. Chen had spotted them, called it out. I'd redirected Turner, who'd found some courage from somewhere, to cover that approach. Watched the kid actually acquire a target and fire, controlled bursts like I'd taught him in those 60 seconds of instruction. The Taliban flankers had gone to ground, temporarily stopped, but our ammunition was finite. Chen was down to 3 magazines. I had 4. Turner had 2 and was burning through them too fast. Rodriguez was unconscious again, pulse thready, needed a medevac within the hour, or he'd bleed out despite the dressings. I'd gotten back on the radio. "Any unit, Team 4, we are Winchester on ammunition and have urgent surgical, need immediate extract, will mark position with smoke." Company commander's voice this time. "Captain Morrison. Team 4, understand your situation, but we have multiple units engaged. Cannot divert birds at this time. Standard procedure. Don't risk a helicopter for a pinned unit. Let them fight their way out or die trying." I'd looked at Chen. He'd looked back. We'd both understood. Then Brennan's voice. Team 4, recommend you break contact and exfil on foot to Rally Point Bravo. 2 clicks through open terrain with a litter casualty and a private who'd barely held it together in a defensive position. Suicide. I'd keyed the radio. Team 1, that is not a viable option. Requesting you move to support our position. Silence. Then, Team 1 is engaged and cannot support. I'd switched back to command frequency. This is Sergeant Jackson. I am taking command of Team 4 operations and requesting immediate close air support on my position. The moral choice wasn't really a choice at all, though my brain tried to frame it that way. The Taliban had started a coordinated assault, coming from 3 directions, proper fire and movement tactics. We'd maybe had 3 minutes before they'd overrun our position. Chen had been wounded by then. Fragment from an RPG that hit the goat shed, tore through his leg. He'd kept firing, but I could see the blood, knew he wouldn't last much longer without treatment. Turner had gone silent, curled up, 1,000-yard stare. Rodriguez was dying. I'd had one option left. The main compound sat 50 meters away, and I'd watched Team 1 through gaps in the wall, Brennan and his guys in good cover, taking occasional shots but not actually engaging, waiting for the Taliban to finish us off so they could call it enemy action. I could have called them out on command frequency, made it official, forced their hand. Could have reported it, burned my career but maybe saved my men. Instead, I'd made a different calculation. Grabbed Chen's rifle, M4 with an ACOG scope, and started providing covering fire for Team 1's position. Called out targets over the radio, directed their fire, basically did their job for them while simultaneously fighting off the assault on our position. Team 1, you have 3 fighters moving to your 6 o'clock, behind the blue truck. Brennan's voice. Surprised. How do you have eyes on our position? Because I'm doing my job, Sergeant. Recommend you do yours. For the next 5 minutes, I'd fought a 2-front battle, protecting my own position while simultaneously keeping Team 1 from getting flanked and killed. It would have been easier to let them die. Would have been justified. Would have solved a lot of problems. But that's not who I was. That's not who my grandmother raised. That's not what the uniform meant, regardless of whether some people thought I deserved to wear it. The awakening came in the aftermath, after the Apache helicopters finally arrived and turned the Taliban position into burning rubble, after the medevac lifted Rodriguez and Chen out, after the brass started asking questions about how a 4-man team got isolated and nearly destroyed. Brennan had approached me in the aid station where I was getting my ears checked for rupture. Stood there for a long moment, helmet under his arm, uniform dusty and torn. I'd expected him to say something dismissive, claim credit, spin the narrative. Instead, he just looked at me. Really looked at me, maybe for the first time since I'd joined his platoon. You saved my life, he'd said finally. You saved my guys' lives. I'd finished lacing my boot. That's the job. You could have let us die. Should have, probably after. He'd trailed off, couldn't quite say it. I'd stood up, faced him directly. After you tried to get me killed? After you used me as bait? After you left my team to die? He'd flinched, nodded. Why didn't you? Because I'm a soldier, I'd said. A real one. Not whatever you are. I'd started to walk away, then turned back. You know the difference between you and me, Brennan? You wear that uniform because it makes you feel powerful. I wear it because it's who I am. You think being a soldier is about dominance. I know it's about duty. You see people as tools. I see them as human beings. That's why I saved you. Not because you deserved it, but because they did. He'd stood there, something like shame crossing his face. Maybe understanding. Maybe just fear of consequences. Captain Morrison had appeared then, gestured for me to follow. In his tent, with the battalion commander on video call, they'd asked me to walk through the entire mission. Every decision, every call, every moment. I'd told them the truth, all of it. The setup, the abandonment, the deliberate isolation. Brennan's pattern of behavior going back weeks. The dog tags on my rack. The revelation came 3 days later after they'd airlifted Chen and Rodriguez to Landstuhl, and the investigation had begun. Captain Morrison called me to the operations tent, had me sit down, pulled out a file folder. Thick one. "Sergeant Jackson," he'd said, "I need to ask you something. Why didn't you ever mention your background?" I'd looked at him, confused. "Sir?" He'd opened the folder. "Says here you graduated from the Ranger Training Brigade. Top 10%. Says you were selected for Delta Force assessment but declined. Says you have 2 Bronze Stars, one with Valor Device, from Iraq. Says you were recommended for promotion to Sergeant First Class 4 times, blocked 4 times, no official reason given." He'd looked up at me. "Says you qualified as a Special Forces Communications Sergeant but turned down assignment to ODA." I'd felt something tighten in my chest. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted." All of that is true, and all of that got me exactly nowhere. Every time I excelled, someone found a reason it didn't count. Every time I was recommended for promotion, the board found me not quite ready. Every time I demonstrated capability, I got assigned to units that didn't want me. After a while, you stop mentioning your qualifications because all it does is make people resentful. Morrison had closed the folder. "Staff Sergeant Brennan is being relieved of duty and will face court-martial. The battalion commander wants to know if you'd be willing to take over the platoon." I'd sat there, stunned. "Sir, I'm supposed to be the problem soldier. Brennan has documentation. Brennan has a paper trail that everyone with sense knew was manufactured. You have a record of actual performance that speaks for itself. We should have seen it earlier. We didn't. That's on us." He'd leaned forward. "I read the after-action report from yesterday. You fought a 2-front battle, saved 8 soldiers including the ones who tried to kill you, and called in fire missions that eliminated a reinforced Taliban squad. You did the job of a platoon sergeant while simultaneously doing the job of a fire team leader. That's not normal competence. That's exceptional leadership under the worst possible circumstances." I'd felt tears trying to come, fought them back. "What about Rodriguez and Chen?" "Rodriguez will recover. Lost some function in his left arm, but he'll live. Chen's going to need surgeries, but he'll walk again. Because you kept them alive long enough for extract." They both submitted sworn statements about what happened, by the way. About the whole deployment. The return to the present came slowly, like surfacing from deep water, lungs burning, disoriented about which way was up. I'd been standing in that kennel at the VA facility for I don't know how long, hand on the chain-link fence, looking at wrecks. The metal was cold under my palm despite the Georgia heat outside, that particular industrial chill of steel that never quite warms. The dog had moved closer during my dissociation. I'd learned to call it that in therapy. Learned the clinical terms for what happened when my mind transported me backward in time without permission. He sat on his haunches now, close enough that I could see the details the staff sergeant had glossed over. The scars on his muzzle weren't just from one incident. They were layered, a history of violence written across his face. One ear had a chunk missing, healed over but permanently altered. His left rear leg, the one he favored, had surgical scars running up the haunch, pins probably, reconstructive work after the IED that killed his handler. And his eyes, those eyes that had first caught my attention, they held the same expression I saw in my own reflection. Alert, but exhausted. Watchful, but weary. The look of something that had survived but hadn't lived, that had made it through but hadn't made it back. The staff sergeant was still there, clipboard in hand, shifting her weight in that way people do when they're waiting for you to finish wasting their time. Behind her, through the open door to the office area, I could see other handlers working with other dogs, smooth interactions, commands given and followed, tails wagging, treats distributed. Normal, functional. Everything Rex wasn't. Everything I wasn't. You said he's aggressive? I'd asked, voice rough from not speaking for however long I'd been standing there. Unresponsive to commands? She'd consulted her clipboard like the answer might have changed since she'd last looked. 3 handlers tried. He bit one. Drew blood. Needed stitches. Wouldn't engage with the other 2, just shut down completely. Wouldn't eat. Wouldn't respond to basic commands, just sat in the corner of his kennel and stared. We can't place him if he won't work, and we can't justify the resources for an animal that poses a safety risk. Animal, not dog, not veteran. Not warrior who'd served in hostile territory and survived trauma that would break most creatures. Just animal. Inventory. A line item on a budget that didn't justify the expense. I'd studied Rex more carefully then, looking past the obvious damage to what remained underneath. His posture, despite everything, maintained discipline. He wasn't cowering, wasn't aggressive. He was waiting, assessing, using the same threat evaluation protocols he'd been trained with, applied now to a situation where the threats were subtler, but no less real. His ears tracked sounds I couldn't hear, processing the environment constantly. When another dog barked somewhere in the front of the facility, his head turned fractionally, located the source, dismissed it as non-threat, returned to watching me. That was training. That was discipline. That was a working dog's mind still functioning even though his spirit had broken. What happened to him? I'd asked, though I already knew part of the answer. Kandahar Province, 2012. His handler was killed by an IED. Dog was in the vehicle, survived the blast. They brought him back, tried to retrain him with new handlers, but he never bonded again. Aggressive when pushed. Withdrawn when left alone. Classic trauma response. She'd said it clinically, like she was describing a mechanical failure in a vehicle, a software glitch in a computer, something technical and fixable, if only the right procedure could be found. But I'd heard something else. Heard myself. Heard every veteran who'd come back broken and been told they weren't trying hard enough to heal. That their trauma was a choice, that recovery was just a matter of following the right protocol and executing the correct steps. Heard every damaged soul who'd been labeled untrainable because the training didn't account for trauma, didn't make space for grief, didn't acknowledge that some things break you in ways that don't fit the manual. "I'll take him," I'd said. The staff sergeant had blinked. "Sir, I don't think you understand. This dog is dangerous. He's not suitable for service placement." "I understand perfectly. I'll take him." "Sir? I was in Kandahar Province in 2011 and 2012. I know what he saw. I know what he carries. And I know that being broken isn't the same as being worthless." I'd looked at her directly. "That dog isn't untrainable. He's traumatized. There's a difference. And if nobody else is willing to put in the work to reach him, then I will. Because someone reached me when I needed it." The resolution came in pieces over the following months, like a puzzle assembling itself from fragments. Rodriguez recovered at Walter Reed, eventually medically retired, with a disability rating and a pension. He'd called me before I left Afghanistan, voice still weak. "You saved my life, brother. I won't forget that." Last I'd heard, he was teaching criminal justice at a community college in New Mexico, married, 2 kids. Doing good. Chen had a harder road. 3 surgeries on his leg, infection, complications. But he'd survived. Sent me a letter about a year after we'd gotten home, told me he'd used his GI Bill to finish his engineering degree, was working for Boeing. Included a picture of his daughter, 4 years old by then, holding a toy airplane. "She'll know your name," he'd written. "She'll know who kept her daddy alive." Brennan faced court-martial, pled guilty to dereliction of duty and conduct unbecoming. They gave him a dishonorable discharge, took his benefits. Part of me felt satisfied. Part of me just felt tired. Turner had surprised everyone. After that mission, something had clicked in him. He'd finished his deployment, re-enlisted, actually made sergeant. Sent me a message through Rodriguez. Tell Jackson I learned what courage looks like. I'd taken the platoon like Captain Morrison offered, finished the deployment, brought everyone home alive, got promoted to Sergeant First Class finally, after 19 years. The promotion board said I'd demonstrated exceptional leadership. I'd thought about all those previous boards, all those times I'd been not quite ready, and realized nothing about my capabilities had changed. Just who was evaluating them. I'd retired in 2015 after 23 years of service. 2 Bronze Stars, 1 with Valor, Purple Heart, Combat Infantryman Badge, Expert Infantryman Badge, and a master's degree in counseling I'd earned online between deployments, thinking maybe I could help other veterans navigate what I'd navigated. The Army gave me a ceremony, a flag, a retirement certificate, shook my hand and thanked me for my service. I'd stood there in my dress blues, thought about my grandmother who'd died while I was in Iraq, wished she could see that sometimes survival and excellence were the same thing. The price of war isn't paid in combat. It's paid in the decades after, in the minutes between midnight and dawn when sleep won't come. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, convinced I was back in that courtyard with Rodriguez bleeding out and Chen screaming and Taliban fighters closing in. Sometimes I'd wake up in that cellar at Fort Benning with Brennan's rifle pointed at my chest. Sometimes I'd wake up in my grandmother's house in Hattiesburg with rocks hitting the porch and voices calling me things that stripped away my humanity. The VA gave me medications, prazosin for nightmares, sertraline for depression, lorazepam for anxiety, pills that helped but didn't fix. Dr. Morrison, different Morrison, no relation to my old captain, walked me through cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, EMDR. Helped some. Didn't make the memories go away, just made them slightly more manageable. My hands still shook when helicopters flew overhead. I still couldn't sit with my back to a door. Still had a go bag packed by the door. Still slept with a knife under my pillow. Still checked corners and exits everywhere I went. 23 years of training, of constant vigilance, of survival. You don't just turn that off. The dreams were the worst. Not the combat dreams, though those came too. But the dreams where I was back in the Army, back in formation, and someone was calling me untrainable, incompetent, not quite ready, and I'd wake up angry, fists clenched, wanting to prove them wrong all over again even though I'd already proved it 1,000 times. The trauma wasn't just the war. It was the lifetime of having to be twice as good for half the recognition. It was knowing that people saw my skin before they saw my service. It was carrying the weight of every ancestor who'd fought for this country and been denied basic dignity in return. That's the price. Not just what you see in combat, but what you carry from a society that questions whether you belong even when you're wearing the uniform, even when you're bleeding for it. The lesson wasn't simple, though people wanted it to be. People wanted me to say that courage conquers all, that dignity wins in the end, that the system eventually recognizes merit. But that wasn't the truth I'd lived. The truth was more complicated, harder, less satisfying. What I'd learned over 62 years and 23 of them in uniform was that you can't control what people see when they look at you. You can't control their prejudices, their assumptions, their need to make you smaller so they can feel bigger. You can only control who you are when nobody's watching, and who you are when it costs you something to be that person. Brennan had tried to kill me, not with a bullet, but with assignments and isolation and paper trails. The system had tried to break me with blocked promotions and dismissals and low expectations. Society had tried to diminish me with words and rocks and closed doors. And I'd survived all of it not because I was exceptional, though maybe I was, but because I'd decided early on that my humanity wasn't up for debate, that my worth wasn't determined by their recognition. My grandmother had asked me to do more than survive. She'd asked me to excel. And I had. Not for them, for me, for her. For every black soldier who'd worn this uniform and been told they didn't belong. For every person who'd been labeled untrainable because the training was designed for someone else. The lesson wasn't that things get better, though sometimes they do. The lesson was that you keep going anyway. You keep being excellent even when excellence isn't rewarded. You keep showing dignity even when dignity isn't respected. You keep seeing humanity in others even when they refuse to see it in you. Not because it's not fair, but because that's what separates who you are from what they think you are. And in the end, that distinction is everything. It's the only thing you truly control. The only thing that's truly yours. The final image is simple, but it carries weight. I'm sitting on my porch in Augusta. Early morning, sun just starting to burn off the humidity that settles overnight, like a blanket. Cicadas already screaming in the pines that border my property. That particular southern sound that means summer, means home, means survival. Coffee getting cold in my hand because I've been holding it too long, thinking too much, lost in the space between memory and presence that veterans occupy. And Rex is beside me, his head resting on my knee, both of us just existing in the silence that speaks louder than words ever could. It took 3 months before he'd let me touch him. 3 months of sitting near his kennel at the VA, just being present, not asking for anything, not expecting response, just showing up every day at the same time like clockwork. He'd watch me from the back of his kennel those first weeks, assessing, calculating threat probability, deciding if I was safe or just another person who'd hurt him eventually. I'd bring a book sometimes, read aloud, let him hear my voice without demands attached. Other times I'd just sit in silence, let him understand that presence didn't require performance. 6 months before he'd take food from my hand, and even then it was cautious, calculated, ready to retreat at the first sign of betrayal. He'd approach slowly, head low, watching my eyes more than my hands, because eyes telegraph intention before hands do, and he'd learned that lesson the hard way. I'd place the food down, step back, give him space to decide if trust was worth the risk. Gradually, incrementally, the distance closed. A year before, he'd sleep in the same room without positioning himself to watch the door, without maintaining that constant vigilance that exhausts you even in rest. Even now, 2 years since I'd brought him home, he still has protocols. He checks the perimeter every morning, patrols the fence line, ensures our space is secure. He still startles at sudden noises, still positions himself between me and strangers, still carries himself like a soldier, even though his war is officially over. We'd worked through it together, 2 traumatized souls learning to trust again, learning that not every loud noise was danger, not every stranger was a threat, not every moment required vigilance. Learning that sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones where you fight, but the ones where you learn to stop fighting long enough to heal. The VA had been right that he was untrainable in the conventional sense. He'd never be a service dog according to their certification standards, never pass their behavioral tests, never work another official mission, or deploy with another unit. He'd never respond to commands with the enthusiasm they wanted, never perform for treats or praise the way their successful cases did. But that wasn't what either of us needed. What we needed was someone who understood without explanation, someone who didn't require words or justification, someone who knew that healing wasn't linear and trauma didn't have an expiration date, someone who understood that surviving and healing were different things and that sometimes surviving was enough. Some mornings he'd have bad days, growling at shadows that held memories invisible to me, pacing the perimeter with an urgency that spoke to threats only he could perceive, unable to settle, caught in a loop of hypervigilance that wouldn't release him. I'd sit with him on those mornings, talk him through it the way Dr. Morrison talked me through my episodes, steady voice and calm presence, anchoring him to the present when the past tried to drag him under. No judgment, no expectation that he should be past this by now, that he should be over it, that he should just move on like people say to veterans as if trauma has a schedule. Some mornings I'd have bad days, the shakes that started in my hands and spread up my arms, the panic that came from nowhere and everywhere, the feeling that the walls were closing in and the air was too thin and something terrible was about to happen, and I needed to move, needed to fight, needed to run, but there was nowhere to go because the threat was inside me. He'd press against my leg on those mornings, solid and warm, 70 pounds of living weight that anchored me to reality, reminded me I was here, now, safe, home. Not in Kandahar, not in Fort Benning, not in that cellar with Brennan's rifle pointed at my chest. Here, with a dog who understood. We'd saved each other, I think, or maybe we'd just learned to carry our damage together, which was its own kind of salvation, its own version of healing that doesn't fit the clinical definitions but works anyway. Behind us, through the screen door, I can hear the TV playing the morning news, that constant stream of information and opinion and manufactured urgency, talking about the war, about veterans, about service and sacrifice. They make it sound noble, make it sound like the hard part is the combat, like everything else is just transition and adjustment. They don't talk about coming home to a country that thanks you for your service, but doesn't want to hear about what that service actually cost. Don't talk about being dismissed or doubted or labeled untrainable when the skills that kept you alive over there make you unsuitable for polite society over here. Don't talk about the decades of work it takes to become human again after the military teaches you to be a weapon, trains you to see threats everywhere, conditions you to respond with violence, and then acts surprised when you can't just turn that off. Rex shifts against my leg, looks up at me with those knowing eyes that have seen things dogs shouldn't see, survived things that should have broken him. And I scratch behind his ears, feel the scars under his fur, rough patches where hair won't grow back, permanent evidence of temporary violence. See the gray in his muzzle that matches the gray in my hair, my beard, the gray that came too early because trauma ages you faster than time. Two old veterans, sitting on a porch, watching the sun rise over Georgia pines. Still here, still breathing, still fighting the wars that never ended, that never will end, that we'll carry until we don't carry anything anymore. Still proving that broken isn't the same as worthless, that damaged isn't the same as disposable, that surviving is its own kind of victory even when nobody gives medals for it. If this story found you at the right time, tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes sharing these difficult memories helps carry the weight. Sometimes knowing someone else understands makes the burden a little lighter. I spent 23 years proving I belonged, proving I was trainable, proving I was worth the investment. And I did prove it. But the real lesson I learned wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about recognizing worth even when others don't. It was about extending grace to the damaged and dismissed, because I knew what that felt like from both sides. That dog they said was untrainable taught me more about resilience than any army manual. He taught me that survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just sitting on a porch, watching the morning come, and deciding to face another day. That's courage too. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't get medals or recognition. The kind that counts anyway.